Now, in times of grief, God often seems distant and out of reach, but that really says more about what grief does to us than it does about God and what He's like. In fact, the Bible offers a number of promises that we can count on in times of loss, and those are promises that we can cling to about how God cares for us when we're grieving. The first one is that God promises the peace of His presence. For God has said, "I will never fail you, I will never abandon you." So we can say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper, I will have no fear. What can mere people do to me?" So you see that in times of grief, we are never abandoned, even though you may feel very alone. And this is a promise that you can cling to as your emotions go up and down. Sometimes you're going to feel more alone, sometimes less so. You can cling to this promise that God will never abandon you. He's not going to leave you alone. And then Jesus pointed to an eternal element of this same promise in John chapter 14. "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you so that you will always be where I am." So you see that Jesus wants us to be with Him forever. It's a relationship that starts here in this life and extends on into eternity, where that separation from God that's caused by our sin has been reversed. And so God promised to be with us during our troubles now. He'll never abandon us. And Jesus also promises to bring us to where He is for eternity. Now, there's a second promise of God that we can cling to in the Bible, how God cares for us. God offers comfort in our present sorrows. Now, the Apostle Paul went through some very difficult trials, and at one point in time, he despaired of his own life. He thought he was going to die. But when he got through on the other side and is reflecting back on the purpose of those trials, he understood the comfort of God, and he expressed that in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they're troubled, we'll be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. For the more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with His comfort through Christ. So the Apostle Paul discovered that God is merciful, that He's the source of our comfort when we're going through tough times. And then in verse 5, he points out something that I find very hopeful. He says God's comfort is proportional to our suffering. He says the more our suffering goes up, the more God's comfort rises to meet it. In other words, there's never going to be a situation of grief or sorrow that's too great that surpasses the comfort that God gives. He's going to give you as much comfort as you need, no matter how tough the thing is that you're going through. And then he points out something else, that God's comfort is not just for us, but that God's going to use His comfort in our life as He's helping us in our grief, so that someday we'll be able to help other people who are going through a similar kind of grief in the future. So God offers comfort in our troubles. Now then, there's a third thing that God promises. God offers confidence in every kind of trial. Listen to Romans chapter 8. Can anything ever separate us from Christ's love? Does it mean He no longer loves us if we have trouble or calamity, or are persecuted or hungry or destitute or in danger or threatened with death? Verse 37, no, despite all these things, overwhelming victory is ours through Christ who loved us. And I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither our fears for today, nor our worries about tomorrow, not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. So the Bible's saying there's nothing at all that can separate you from the love that Jesus has for you. No trouble, no calamity. He mentions all kinds of things, and included in that would be the death of somebody that you love. And then he gets more specific in verse 38. He mentions three things. He says death. Number one, death cannot separate you from God's love for you. Then secondly, he mentions the fears that we have today. And when you're grieving and you've lost somebody, fear can become so intense and you're just wondering how you're going to make it. He said that fear doesn't have to separate you from God. And then he talks about the worries of tomorrow. In grieving, you can think about tomorrow. You just wonder how you're going to make it without him or her. You just wonder what the future holds and what are you going to do when things get difficult and how are you going to handle this situation or that situation. But he promises that none of those worries about tomorrow have the power to drive a wedge between you and your relationship with God. What a great source of confidence that is. And then there's another promise that God makes to us. God offers hope of a better world. Look at Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was gone. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, "Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever." And the one sitting on the throne said, "Look, I'm making everything new." And then he said to me, "Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true." Thankfully, this world is not all there is. For those who belong to Christ, death is not the end. Look at these verses and see how many times the word new is used. And in verse 5, God says, "I'm making everything new." And you can see what an amazing world this will be. We've already seen that God's presence will be there. We talked about that before, but here we see it again. We see that it's a place of wonderful beauty and perfection. And for those who are grieving, verse 4 offers a wonderful promise. No more tears, no more death, no more crying, no more sorrow, no more pain. All of these things gone forever. That's the hope we have. God gives us this hope of a new world. Now, if you're a Christian, I encourage you to grab hold of these promises that we've looked at in these last few minutes, knowing that even if your grip is weak, God has a strong grasp of you. God's grip is strong. And if you're not sure where you stand with God, you can be. You can have the confidence that's expressed in these verses. It starts by trusting Jesus, entrusting your life and your eternity entirely to him and to him alone. And you can find out more about what that means and how that works by going to PursueGOD.org/foundations. That's how you can find out what it means to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's where our confidence in God's promises comes from knowing him. But I pray that you'll experience the comfort and care of God through these good promises whenever you might have to go through grief.